Hi everybody, it's Cash. Welcome back. Thank you very much for joining me. One of the most frequent requests I've had over the past 3 years in terms of transition pictures was for Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek. And I think I held back mainly because I've not seen an episode of Star Trek the TV show. I saw the first movie, Star Trek the Motion Picture, and quite enjoyed it. It was alright, but I've never seen the TV show, so I wasn't really that interested in Gene Roddenberry and knew nothing about him, actually. He died in 1991 at the age of 70. He'd had a couple of strokes and was wheelchair bound by that point, and he'd been ill anyway for a while. That was what caused him to get out of television and just convalesce. Basically, he had diabetes and high blood pressure and other things. But he led a pretty dramatic, even tumultuous life. Flew 89 combat missions during World War II. He was a pilot, and when World War II ended, I believe he became a pilot for Pan Am. And only after, I think he'd had something like 3 crashes, or been involved in 3 crashes, and that's when he gave up being a pilot and he went into television, used his military experience and his flying experience to write scripts for various shows, including The Lieutenant was one of them, and also Highway Patrol. But obviously his main creation was Star Trek in 1964. They had a terrible time trying to get this thing produced. Nobody really wanted to take it up, and then finally Desilu did. Lucille Ball saw the value of it, and she produced the series, and of course it went on to massive success. But while that was going on, he was on drugs. He was quite a big drug taker, amphetamines, cocaine, marijuana, and a bit of a womanizer as well, quite roguish. I think he would get married and then have an affair with somebody, then have an affair with somebody else, and so on. I'm not quite sure of the details, but he was a bit of a player in that regard. After Star Trek ended, which it did after 3 seasons, he did a lot of stuff. I mean, he didn't give up by any means, and I think he was even involved in Star Trek The Next Generation, but he had to quit due to illness. He did a lot of stuff. He contributed a lot of scripts to different things, but nothing took off in the same way that Star Trek did. But as I said, he had diabetes and high blood pressure and gradually became sicker and sicker and sicker. And then he had a stroke. He lost the use of one arm and was confined to a wheelchair. And then he had another stroke. And he died at the age of 70, as I said. He was a Southern Baptist when he was very young, apparently. But then he dumped all of that and became a basic humanist. He couldn't buy into the whole idea of having to go to church every week and bow down or kneel down before a God that required you to praise him or sing songs to him or whatever. It suggested insecurity, which goes against everything that a God would be. And of course, he was right. God is simply an infinite field of consciousness that we're all plugged into. It doesn't require you to sing to it. I mean, you can, but it doesn't require you to do that. You just tap into it. You don't need to pray to it or beseech it or anything. You already have the God you need, the dose of that within you. And so you just align with that, and you are part of the God energy. And so on that score, Gene Roddenberry was correct. But I went into his energy for his transition pictures, and initially he was feeling incredibly cramped in the passageway he was in. It wasn't immensely dark, which suggested he was very much in the throes of crossing over at this point, the early stages. But he did find it very hard to walk along the passageway. This was difficult for him for some reason, but he hunched over, metaphorically speaking, of course, and he shuffled along, and he came to a fork in the road, you might say. One way off to the right was a continuation of the path he'd been on, the hunched path, but off to the left there was a get out. There was a sign of reprieve. I went up there just to see what there was, and there was like a hole in the roof that he could get out of. but there were rocks and there was water pouring over the rocks like a waterfall. This could be tears. In past pictures, these have been tears, weeping, grieving of people and so on, people worrying for your safety and so on. And he couldn't get up there. It was like, yeah, I see it. Yeah, I could make it. Maybe, but the water's against me and the rocks are steep, and he didn't seem to have the stamina to make it that far. So, although there was a chance, maybe he came closer to the surface, it wasn't going to work. So I went back down again and continued on the path that he was on. And this continued down and down. And just ahead of him was a small area of water, like a pond, maybe, but underlit, like a fancy swimming pool, underlit, so that he waded into it and it felt great. I am assuming this is some kind of treatment he must have received while he was in care. And he waded through it feeling, in his consciousness, of course, this is metaphorical, but feeling relaxed and without a care, and like, yeah, it's all gonna be all right. Then he got out of the pool and came to another fork in the road. This one on the left led up to another hole in the ceiling, like another chance of reprieve, another chance of getting out of this situation, of resurfacing. But I really, as him in this energy, didn't have the stamina anymore for real. And so I carried on along the path, took the right-hand fork and went on down. That get out, that exit, was the final possibility of him recovering before he entered the darkened passageway which always accompanies people's final stages of death. And it brought him out into that symbolic, metaphorical meet and greet cave that I always seem to see in these pictures. And there was a mound of earth, or symbolic earth, on the ground, and he sat on it and contemplated. And I sensed just a feeling of, this is it, right? This is where I find out. This is where it all ends. It was an odd moment because I didn't feel he really wanted to sever the ties he had with his human ego self. There was a reluctance to release those ties, but at the same time he was very, very curious about what lay ahead. Was I right? Where do we go after all of that? And in the end, curiosity was what got him off the mound of symbolic earth and had him walking up the tunnel, this tunnel that I always see that leads to the light. And it wasn't an easy journey. It felt like one of those hikes where you get a bit of a stitch and you have to stop and catch your breath. It was taxing for him. Maybe he overthought things. Maybe he was unwilling to completely sever his ties, and that was making the going even harder. When he finally got to that chamber at the top, it was more like an arena. It was actually quite big. And the dome of light was surrounded by concentric circles of earth, whatever, that he would have to get over in order to climb into the light. And what was also interesting was that the light wasn't just a simple dome. Many people just step into it and from there they ascend. In his case, it felt more like a shaft of light, like an elevator that you step into, and then you were whisked away. And I know this bears a very strange resemblance to the kind of beam me up Scotty thing of Star Trek, but that's purely coincidental. It wasn't like that at all. This was more about asking him to align with the energies of the universe. Align with them and we will whisk you away. If you don't, then you will stay here, and you can't stay here. He seemed peculiarly attached to the lower frequencies of his earthly life, whatever he'd done in form. He was attached to that. And it's almost as if Grace was saying, let go of that, and you'll get this, and you will advance toward the light. Now let go of that, and you'll advance further toward the light. It was a trade-off, a give and take, a negotiation almost. And it wasn't something he did unwillingly, as far as I can tell, but there was a sense of being very, very locked into where he had been. He was being asked to align with these forces so that he could transition completely. Maybe in the distant future, maybe this is what he had a vision of, maybe that's how human beings will transport themselves. Somebody will come up with a technology, like in Star Trek, whereby you align with the forces of the universe, natural forces, and that's what transports you, instead of jet fuel and all sorts of propulsion devices. Maybe all that will go and we end up aligning with the forces of the universe, and that's what takes us to where we want to go. But eventually, after this quite complicated negotiation, he let go of what had been holding him back, because the momentum is forward after all. He let go of all of that, and as soon as he reached the light, he went really, really fast. It was simply about balance in the end, I think. In his consciousness, the scales were tipped towards his mortal life and his mortal attachments and his ego self. And what he was being asked to do was take the weights off that side and put them on this side, his spiritual self, his soul self, his eternal divine self. And once they were all on that side, he could go. And he went. It was a complicated transition for perhaps a multi-layered, quite complicated man. But of course, as you climb up the tunnel, you release all of that, including illnesses. You become lighter, you become your soul and spiritual self. And the mortal self dissipates. The ego is left behind, concerns are left behind, illnesses and so on. And you become your pure light being, your soul and spiritual self. And that's what shot up through the beam. And he went on his way. And yes, he did find out what was at the end of it all. And that's what I got for Gene Roddenberry. Thanks a lot for watching, guys. Bye-bye.